Michael, again, I apologize. Sometimes, things happen and the show runs late, but we have some time to talk because I wanna get you on my birthday show. Michael,
Again, congratulations.
thank you, man. Thank you so much. He is the Director of Planning and Land Use for the City of New York. He's been doing New York City planning since 1988. He's also adjunct professor of urban urban planning. I knew him. Urban planning at Pace University. Welcome to the neighborhood, my cousin Michael. How are you, Michael?
David, I am fine, but I need to correct the biography you just gave. I am now retired at
Oh,
the age of 77 after working 50 years in a variety of positions for the city of New York and teaching in a variety of locations. I am now fully retired at age 77.
as Rabbi Solomon would say, Mazel Tov. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Do you miss it? Do you miss because you used to love teaching?
I do. I miss it terribly. I miss working for the city because I was always in positions in which I created policy, not just did day-to-day work, but created policy for historic districts and zoning in New York City. I worked on the Seaport. I worked on the Soho Artist Housing District. I worked on the Greenwich Village Historic District. I always had fascinating projects in which I felt I'm not just doing day-to-day work, but I'm affecting policy in New York City. I am creating locations in the city where people will be enjoying what they're seeing and which makes the city vibrant. And so I do miss that. After 50 years of doing that, suddenly I find myself in a position where I'm not a policy maker. I'm a member of the local community board in Manhattan, appointed by the borough president, along with 50 other members of our community. And what I do now in my position there is comment on policies created by the city of New York. So it puts me in a different position. Instead of being a policy maker, I'm now a policy commenter. About teaching, I loved teaching. One of the most fascinating things I've ever done, and I taught in two places. I taught undergraduate students at Pace University for 10 years, right across the street from City Hall. And I taught graduate urban planning students at the Fund for the City of New York. At the point that I was teaching, I was already in my 50s and 60s, and I had so much to share with the students. And the one thing I can say is that the most gratifying part of being a teacher is when you feel that the class members appreciate what you're telling them, understand what it is that you're trying to put forward as the message, and have a takeaway from the class. And I would end each semester by going around the room, and I gave them all a pizza party every year as the last class. And I would go around the room and say, give us one takeaway from this class. What will you always remember other than me about what you learned in this room? And the kids were fantastic. Sometimes you think it goes in one ear and out the other ear, but they listened. And each of them would have a favorite thing that they would talk about, whether it was Jane Jacobs, who wrote the fantastic book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, whether it was New York City as the melting pot, whether it was something like Baron Haussman rebuilt Paris to make it a more livable city and a more military defensible city. Everyone had something that they remembered from the class. And to me, that was gratifying. At least they had one takeaway that made the class meaningful for them. So after working for 50 years as a city employee and as a teacher, I'm now fully retired. I'm still active, which is really wonderful. I have to keep the mind active, again, on the local community board, the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. I'm on the award committee, and I'm a member of the local business improvement district pertaining to the center of Greenwich Village, and we call it the Village Alliance. So I try to keep myself busy. I do not like, as you know, Dave, I do not like inactivity. I've been active all of my life. And so this is now probably the end chapter of my life, but it's something that keeps me busy.
Well, for sure. Let me ask you, so in terms of the city planning that you've been doing, as you said, for 50 years, and what are one or two of your proudest accomplishments where you can go to that part of town and go, I helped get this done. I didn't put bricks down, but I made sure that the feng shui or whatever you call it is nice for people who are here.
My greatest accomplishment is something that I did in my very early years at the Department of City Planning, way back in the 1970s, when as a junior planner, not a senior planner being given a project, but as a junior planner, I was given a project to examine the phenomenon in what was then known as Hell's 100 Acres, which we today call the Soho district, south of Houston. And Hell's 100 Acres was the South Houston industrial area, and later on it became simply known as Soho, in some ways a takeoff on Soho in London. The assignment I was given was we have people living illegally in manufacturing buildings. Find out why they're there. Is it safe? Is it unsafe? And what can we do to make it better? I embarked upon a 2-year study in which I canvassed the entire Soho area from Houston Street down to Broadway and all the way from the Bowery to 6th Avenue, and found 8,000 artists living illegally in industrial buildings. Why were they there? They were there because manufacturing was leaving the antiquated buildings in this area. They were too small, they were inefficient, the sidewalks were too narrow, the roadways were too narrow, there was insufficient loading docks, modern manufacturing couldn't occur. And we're talking the 1970s in this area. It was a fascinating thing to discover a natural reuse of existing buildings. The beauty of what was happening is that the police department, the fire department, all the officials downtown were delighted to have the artists living in the buildings because they made them safe. They were the eyes on the street. If there was a fire, they contacted the fire department immediately. If there was a problem or an emergency on the street, they contacted the police department immediately. They were the eyes on the street. And the fire department and the buildings department said to me, you have to do something to make this legal. If these folk are not going to be in these buildings, surely the entire area will come down in flames one day. I brought this back to the City Planning Commission, and the more I studied it, the more I demonstrated to them that the number of manufacturing jobs was declining every year, and the number of illegal artist occupancies was increasing every year. By 1971, I was successful in convincing the City Planning Commission that we had to rezone the Soho area, it is now known as the Soho, to a joint living work quarter area, meaning manufacturing can be there legally and artists in residence can be there legally. And it has been that district for 50 years. One side effect, which was really a major accomplishment that I hadn't initially anticipated, is that most of those buildings are cast iron buildings. It is the center of cast iron architecture. It's like prefabrication today. The parts of the building facade would be manufactured offsite and brought to the site and attached to a wooden structure. The cast iron district is an absolutely fabulous, fabulous area. I'm sure, Dave, you've seen it in the years that you were in New York City, south of Houston Street, north of Canal. And we managed to get the area designated as the Cast Iron Historic District in 1973 to preserve 40 blocks of these fabulous old buildings that go back 120 years. So everything I worked on in the 1970s came, which I think is my major accomplishment as a young person, was finding a way to have legal artist occupancy of the buildings to make them safe, to allow the artists to obtain mortgage financing to improve their property, and then to have it designated as the Soho Industrial District, the Soho Cast Iron District. Now,
It didn't gentrify though. I mean, once you start knowing that the artists are there, you can't just let them squat illegally. I mean, did it throw out all these young broke artists?
Absolutely not. Again, the police department and the fire department wanted them there.
You
What they required is that they put a sign near the door saying AIR2, meaning there's an artist in residence on the second floor, AIR3, an artist on the third floor. But they couldn't do more than two, because if they did more than two, they would then become a multiple dwelling and they would have to comply with state laws. So whenever you saw an AIR on the face of a building near the doorway, you knew there were artists there. No one wanted them to leave. Everyone wanted them to stay.
And did manufacturing sort of come back at all, or just enough manufacturing to, because you said,
manufacturing never came back. Manufacturing is completely gone. What's happened to the Soho area now is a little bit unexpected, but I shouldn't say that. It has become a primary shopping area, an upscale shopping area. Broadway has become unbelievable, rivaling Madison Avenue or Fifth Avenue or any of the uptown streets. Broadway now has some of the finest shops in the city, which a lot of the people who live in Soho are not too fond of because it's making it an expensive neighborhood.
Right. There you
But
go.
manufacturing never came back. We now have some of the finest shops in New York City in Soho. Of course, the pandemic has influenced what's happening. A lot of the stores are boarded, but they're coming back. They're coming back. They're opening up shop again, and they're trying to stay above water. But every time we turn around, we see there are no more manufacturing jobs. They're completely gone. No one can manufacture in the city of New York. The streets are so narrow. You can't get a truck up and down that street anymore. The sidewalks are totally impossible. There's very, very few loading bays. The main use of those buildings is occupancy by artists. And now we're getting general population moving in as well. And the city is now allowing a certain amount of general occupancy if you can demonstrate that you need the space for other purposes, such as you're a manufacturer of clocks, for example, or other specialty items, and you want to do it at home. That is now legal. And the city of New York is trying to find other ways now. Those who succeeded me, those who are in the same position I was in 50 years ago, who are looking at it and saying, how can we open the area to a wider level of residential occupancy? So the work I did way back in the early 1970s has resulted in keeping the area, preventing it from the Wrecker's Ball demolishing it. You will recall that Robert Moses destroyed a lot of the fabric of New York City for his urban renewal projects and his desire to build highways. One area he never touched and was never able to touch was the Soho district because we had uses for those buildings and we prevented their demolition and we found a way to keep them alive and vibrant. Unfortunately, the side effect of that is it has become a high cost area. But that's one of the prices you have to pay in New York City.
Well,
If,
you
if
are,
somebody's successful, it's expensive.
you live in New York, right? You're still, are you?
I live in Greenwich Village, just a few blocks from Soho. Now, I live in the heart of the Greenwich Village Historic District.
Right. And
So,
so you've been there for, gosh, what, 30, 40 years or?
well, I know longer than that. I moved here, Dave, in 1967 when I was still in graduate school. And I'm trying to now do the arithmetic and forgetting, but you weren't even born yet, are you?
Well,
When I
67,
moved,
I was born, but just barely.
what year are you born? I'm forgetting now.
I'm 57 years old. That puts me back in 1964. So I was a toddler.
So you were just a baby when I moved here in 1967 from Brooklyn, which
Yeah.
is the old neighborhood the family comes from. And I moved here to Greenwich Village because I loved Greenwich Village and I wanted to be in Greenwich Village. And Aunt Sadie, one of our aunts, lived here in Greenwich Village because she worked in Midtown Manhattan. I
Right.
came here because of Soho. I came here because of Greenwich Village. I came here because of, and let's be honest, the gay bars. I knew already while I was living in Brooklyn that the gay bars in New York City are located in Greenwich Village. And I knew that that is where I need to be.
Well,
And that's,
that brings up the question because I was shocked when we told last time we saw you in person and we had dinner with you. I didn't know that you were at Stonewall on the night that Stonewall became Stonewall. You know, in the popular culture, it became a meme, as it were, like Bernie Sanders in a chair. So tell us that story. It wasn't a riot. It was a party.
well, there are many interpretations of what happened that night, but let me go back 2 years. When I moved in 1967, I knew that the central location of the gay bars is around Christopher Street. So I always went to Christopher Street and was very reluctant because I'd never been in a gay bar and I'd only been with a few male people. I'd never been to a gay bar before. And I always used to walk past the Stonewall and said, someday I'm going to have the guts to go into that place. And sure enough, one Saturday night in 1967, I said, okay, I am going into the Stonewall. This is where I belong. And I was at home. I saw men dancing with men. I saw men hugging each other. I saw men kissing each other. I saw women kissing each other. I saw straight people there who came to have fun with the gay people. I saw drag queens there. Everybody was allowed. Everyone was acceptable. They were black, they were white, they were brown, they were Puerto Rican. No matter what you were accepted at Stonewall if you came to have a good time. On the Friday night of the raid in 1969, I was there with a date. someone I had met a few weeks earlier, and we kept going back because we liked dancing. They had a wonderful back area for dancing. They had two bars up front. It had been a restaurant and a garage that they combined into one large space. And I'm standing at the bar and I'm ordering drinks for us, and suddenly the lights go off. The lights go up. The
Yeah.
music goes off.
Yeah.
And now you can see everyone's faces, and someone yells raid. The police were raiding the establishment, and my date turned to me and said, they don't want us. We're the patrons. They want the owners of this bar who have not made their payoff. At that point in time, all gay bars had to pay off the police department to keep them away from the gay bars because they were considered at that point illegal. And there were always raids of bars all over the city, and they would close them down, they would make their payoff, and they would reopen the next day. What happened the night of that raid, it was a Friday night, it was unbelievable. The air was thick with the smell of cologne and beer and cigarettes. I was smoking cigarettes then at my time too. And suddenly to have that silence in the room, and everyone filed out slowly onto the street. And when we got onto the street, there was a sea of police cars like I have never seen in my whole life, all of them with their lights focusing on those of us coming up. I was terrified. I said, I've got to get out of here as soon as possible. People will find out that I'm in a gay bar. Oh my God, I'm not ready yet for the world to know. I got out into the street. We got a block away. My boyfriend turned to me and said, we're not going anywhere. We're going back. The kids aren't leaving. They're not doing what they always did. And the reason for it was a very, very big Friday night crowd. The biggest night of the week was Friday night. And people did not want to go home. And we stood there in the street and we hugged and we kissed and we held hands and we danced. And we were saying to the police and to the city of New York and to the world, we're not going anyplace. We're staying here and we're coming back every night. And we're going to do this until you accept us for who we are. We came back Saturday night and we came back Sunday night. At that point, the mayor called in the tactical police force, which is the riot police. And they came with their white outfits and their white helmets and their white motorcycles, and they really broke up the crowd. And that's when it started to reach the newspapers that something big is happening here in Greenwich Village. It became known as a riot, but it was never a riot. I never saw rioting. I never saw any kind of rioting in the streets as we saw in the Capitol building of the United States 2 weeks ago. I saw kids dancing in the street. I saw kids yelling at the police, we're staying, we're not going anywhere. Excuse me. I saw the police trying to break up the crowd, but I saw the crowd staying. Now, the only reason the crowd left by Monday is that it was back to the work week, and there was no reason to go back anymore because at this point in time, the mayor had deployed the tactical police force to make sure that the Stonewall stayed closed. The tradition had been for the bar to reopen the next day, but Stonewall owners were afraid to reopen. They didn't want any more bad publicity. And, and that was the start of, in my mind, the gay rights movement in New York City and in the world. Stonewall.
And it's interesting. You had been there since '67. This was already like 3 years later. You had never seen a raid. You were never bothered by the cops. You were never.
No, never. And I was never in a raid too. I was terrified. I was 20, 25 at the time. No, I was 27, 20, 28. I'd never been in a raid. And when I heard the word raid, it terrified me. But again, I was assured by my friends and the date I was with it, they don't want us. They want the patrons of this bar. Just file out quietly. And there were big changes that happened after that. It became easier to go to gay bars in the city. There was a lot of criticism of the police department for raiding bars. Everyone knew there was a lot of corruption happening. Everyone knew that they were on the take, and it began to slowly disappear. And a lot of the bar owners refused to make the payments and refused to give in to the threat of a raid. Things changed after. Stonewall was an amazing event in the history of New York and in the history of gay rights in that it changed the attitude of the world to the fact that gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people have the right to be a part of civilization. There is an addendum to this story, which you're far too young to remember, but there is the issue of my not having been out at that time, I thought. to family and friends and
I was
co-workers.
going to ask you about that, about, considering my family, and I'm wondering what that was to,
Well, let me
yeah.
let me tell you how that worked with your family. I started getting phone calls all during the week from people like, well, your father and your aunt saying, and my brother saying things like, we know you go to places like that. We just want to make sure you're okay and you're safe. It's like they knew, we never talked about it, but they knew all along that I was going to gay bars. They knew I was gay. We just never talked because you didn't talk about it in the 1960s. You didn't, Stonewall made it possible to talk to family members and say, I am gay, this is my lifestyle, and this is how I'm going to live.
I mean,
At that point
stupid,
in time, you didn't.
stupid
So,
as I am, I never knew. I mean, I just thought you were, because I wasn't sexual at the time that I knew you growing up. And it never, I mean, you were just cousin Michael. I never, and the fact that you weren't married or didn't have a girl, I didn't, but you never brought a boyfriend. It
but now,
never, you couldn't
but
have. Yeah,
But now, when I am married, but now that I am married to Ray, who you have met,
of course.
if Ray doesn't come with me to a family event, everyone says, "Where's Uncle Ray?" So things have changed so substantially over the 50 years, and Stonewall did that. There's another part to the story too.
Yeah.
On Monday morning, when I came back to work after the rebellion in the streets, I was a little bit concerned. Gee, will the folk here in the city of New York, a city agency, know anything about the fact that I was part of that rebellion? Because it was all over the news, all over the press, all over television. And my coworker said to me, so Michael, tell us what it was like to be part of that rebellion. I never had to tell them. They knew. They said, you were there, weren't you? You live in Greenwich Village. What was it like? I said, what am I wearing? A sign that everybody knows that I was at Stonewall? It was the easiest thing in the world to come out
Wow,
after Stonewall. And
that's
having
great.
been there made it easy for me because I was terrified, but everyone accepted it immediately. And suddenly you were able to talk about it, which is something you couldn't do up until that point in time.
Now, let me ask you, first of all, you're married. Say Ray is your husband. When did you
That's right.
get married and where and
Ray and I are legally married now.
how long?
Oh dear, that's the difficult question. I think it's 9 years, but we've been together for 31 years, but we did the official wedding as soon as it became legal in the state of New York.
How did you meet Ray?
Okay, well, that's an interesting story.
Good.
When after Stonewall closed, and there were bars now all over the city. And bars did specialize in different kinds of clientele. They were bars that you had to go to wearing a jacket and tie. They were called suit bars. And I used to go there after work sometimes because it was comfortable if you're wearing a suit to go to Midtown near the office buildings and wearing a jacket and tie and look really nice without dancing. And then there were the dance bars on the weekend. But there were also bars where people went to meet people that they wanted. And there was a particular bar on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, right under the Queensboro Bridge, that was called the Twilight, which was a bar known as where Asians and Americans meet. And I always had a fondness for Asians. And I used to go there quite frequently on Saturday night. And I was standing there one Saturday night at the bar. And Ray, who had just come in off the boat, right off the boat, as a nurse from the Philippines with a group of his friends, came in together. And I spotted him immediately. They were so terrified of being in New York. They were so terrified of New Yorkers that when one of them went to the bathroom, all three went to the bathroom. When one of them went to the bar, all three went to the bar. It took me 2 hours to separate him from that crowd. And finally, I walked over, we started talking, and he came home with me that night. And that was the beginning of our relationship 31 years ago.
Wow. Wow. As we would say, Mazel tov. We're talking, by the way, with my cousin Michael Levine, who is talking about obviously hell of a life and life of experiences. But I also want to know, because we have someone in common that I quite love, my Aunt Sadie.
Right?
So first of all, I want you to remind me, because I always do this. I never know this kind of thing. A, how are we related? And how are we mutually related to Aunt Sadie? And tell me about your relationship with her.
All right, so that's interesting because being of your generation, it's not always clear. And there are other younger kids in the family who did ask me the same question. So let's put it this way. Your grandfather, Uncle Sam, my Uncle Sam, your grandfather, who is the father of your dad,
Right.
was the brother of Aunt Sadie. And so my mother and your father were brother and sister. Aunt Sadie was another sister. We had Aunt Ida. We had Uncle Mike.
Wait.
There were
Your,
five
your,
children.
hold on, again, your, sorry to do this to people who are watching, but this is important to me. So your mother and who were what again?
My mother and your grandfather,
Oh, my grandfather.
your grandfather Sam, were brother and sister.
So wait, you're not Sadie's
And
kid.
my mother was another sister,
Oh, okay. What's her name? I forgot her name.
Dora.
Dora. Okay.
She
So,
died when I was very young.
okay.
Now there were two other siblings. There was Uncle Mike, and there was Aunt Ida. So there were five siblings,
Wow. Okay.
of which your grandfather Sam was one of them, Sam Lefkowitz.
Right.
Now, everyone got married except for Aunt Sadie. She worked all of her life, and Dora, my mother, his sister, died when I was 13 years old. Now, we lived in the same building in Brooklyn with our grandfather, who would be your great grandfather, Louis Lefkowitz.
Oh, hello.
And
Yeah.
she lived with her father because she never married, and we lived in the same building. And when my mother, Dora, passed away when I was 13, Aunt Sadie took over raising me and my brother. So that's how you know Aunt Sadie as a second mother to us.
Yeah. So,
But
and by
again,
the way, your brother is Sheldon Levine.
and my brother Sheldon.
Right.
So Aunt Sadie took care of Shelley and me in the absence of our mother Dora, who was the sister of your grandfather Sam.
Wow. So give us some, because Aunt Sadie was this prototypical, an aunt to me, sort of a surrogate mom to you, Greenwich Village fun aunt. Do I get that right? I mean, she lived in the village. She lived and she would. I mean, I just remember she loved to go to the cookery. She loved to go to the theater. She had a joie de vivre would be the word. What do
Exactly.
you remember about her?
Exactly, and you're right. That's one of the reasons I moved to Greenwich Village, because she moved to Greenwich Village, and in my teens, I, what happened was when our grandfather, Louis Lefkowitz, your great grandfather, passed away.
Right.
She no longer had a reason to remain in Brooklyn. She moved to Greenwich Village because she worked in the city in Manhattan in the 20s, which at that time was a luggage manufacturing area. And she loved the city. She loved Greenwich Village. When she lived in Brooklyn, she always came home late because she'd go to dinner, she'd go to theater. She had friends who lived here, but she was always loyal to her father, your great grandfather, my grandfather. And it wasn't until he passed away when I was 17 that she finally moved to Greenwich Village. And she moved into Washington Square Village, just south of Washington Square. You remember that very
Yes,
well.
I remember her apartment.
It was an old Robert Moses slum clearance project just north of Soho, but she was one of the first tenants. And if you recall, when you were a kid, she always had the family over on Sundays. She would order a food, a deli to serve in her home, or she would take us all to the cookery and to
Yep.
other restaurants in the neighborhood.
To see Alberta Hunter. Yeah.
Alberta Hunter playing at the piano. She loved that. There's nothing she loved more than sitting there and listening to Alberta Hunter at the piano with family members sitting around the table. She loved the cookery. She loved the Knickerbocker restaurant a block away as well, which does have live entertainment. Cookery's gone, Knickerbocker's still there.
Still there. Wow. Yeah.
Can I interrupt
She
for
loves
one
theater.
second?
She
This
loves
has been,
movies.
Oh,
no, I have enjoyed
Leslie's
this.
been
I
listening.
know David can't believe I could have been this quiet for this long. Michael, what a pleasure to. We share so many different things about the time frame, and my sister lives on 13th Street, and I know people in the Greenwich Village. I mean, I know people who belong to. It's been a pleasure. I wish I could stay longer. And I love the Knickerbocker, and I loved Alberta Hunter because I went to NYU, and so So anyway, be gesund. It was lovely, and
And Leslie, thank you for being here. It's my pleasure to have met you.
thank you, and I hope that you'll come back maybe and play with us. Okay.
Well, yeah, see, now that Michael knows how the quiz goes, maybe I can
Well,
get
then maybe he'll run away, but but it was lovely. Thank you so much for letting me listen. Take care, guys.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Leslie. Hope to see you next week on the
Happy
show.
birthday, David.
Thank you.
Yes, just happy birthday, David.
Thank you, Leslie. So we are here with Michael Levine, my cousin, sharing stories about my Aunt Sadie. And yes, I do remember her apartment, and I do remember going to the cookery one time. I think she took us to Forbidden Broadway. And then
Yes, she took us to the show Forbidden Broadway, which was so much fun.
Yeah. Let me ask you, we all assume, I guess my parents, everybody knew you were gay. I knew nothing. I think they assumed Sadie was also gay just because she never married. But you knew was she in love with her boss and they never In the,
Yes, she was in love with her boss, but her boss was already married by the time she went to work for him, and that was the problem, and that prevented her from ever marrying someone else. She dated men.
she
She
did.
dated men over the years. We met the men that she dated, and they were never quite up to the same level as the boss for whom she worked, who was a very powerful, very strong person. And the love affair that she had for him even went on after he was gone and after he passed away. She still remained in love with his memory. Now, mind you, she was friends with the family. I have photographs, one photograph somewhere in the family album of a picture taken in Atlantic City. And he, the boss, the push carts, I forget what they call them, where they push you up and down the boardwalk. You,
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
I can't remember what they're called. So there's one photograph now, which is absolutely fascinating. The three of them, the
Yeah.
boss,
Yeah.
his wife, and Aunt Sadie, sitting in the same cart, being pushed up and down on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. She was a member of the family. She knew the children. She went to the weddings and the bar mitzvahs, and they came to our weddings and our bar mitzvahs, but he was already married to someone else.
So.
And she could never find a man who could come up to the standards that he set.
Wow,
And
because I was, we always wondered about that because and saying it was great. It's like, how come she doesn't get married? And that was truly the reason. Let me get back a little bit to your life's work and what you were doing with urban planning and all that. So, we are, forgetting even the friggin' pandemic, but the bridges are crumbling, the tunnels are crumbling. If you could fix the infrastructure of New York to save it and bring it into the 21st century properly, what would you suggest? What would you do? How would you do it to keep New York a major great American city?
transportation is the major issue right now.
Yeah.
So the bridges are crumbling, the tunnels are crumbling, the transportation system is suffering terribly. People aren't using subways, people are afraid of subways, people are using buses where they can. The transportation system is the artery of the city. It keeps the city going, and we've neglected it for far too long. And even before the pandemic, we were neglecting it. If you recall, Superstorm Sandy impacted our subway system enormously. Subway lines had to be closed. They were not resilient to the kind of flooding that we had. And we had to close the L train. We had to close so many others. We've been negligent in keeping our infrastructure up to date, not remaining cognizant of, beyond the pandemic, the biggest threat facing New York City and most cities are coastal cities built on waterways because at one time water was the only form of transportation we had. We are now experiencing enormous global climate change. We're experiencing sea level rise. Every city, every major city that is on any waterway, and New York is one of the prime ones, will be experiencing more and more flooding in the future years. We need to make sure that as we rebuild the city, as we rebuild our infrastructure, that we are more and more resilient. We're taking measures in the city right now to rewrite our zoning regulations to require that anything built within the floodplain area, which keeps growing and growing every time we have a storm. It's now almost all of Lower Manhattan is a floodplain. Everything has to be built to be resistant to sea level rise. If you think about what happened to, and I know that you were in Colorado at the time,
Yeah.
but when we had Superstorm Sandy here, the water came in from the Hudson River on the west and from the East River on the east and met in the middle of Lower Manhattan, flooding the entire island. And it knocked Lower Manhattan out of business for close to 3 months. So we had transportation to repair, and we have buildings to repair. And as new buildings come online right now, they are being required to be built higher or to have flood resistant provisions within them that the water would go in and back out again without damaging any part of the building. It's a whole new approach to what life is like. Strengthen our infrastructure, make it resistant to climate change, and make our buildings resistant to climate change. This is the biggest challenge we face in the current century once the
I
pandemic is over.
would never have even thought of that as flooding as being the thing or the problem. To me, To me, it's just about having more people than New York ever had to handle before using the same amount of stuff. And always the question occurred to me, and your city planner, is like the ideal way to fix the MTA, the subway system in Manhattan, is you just, for a year, you tear up everything and redo it from scratch. You make brand new subway tracks, cars, intersect, wherever the tracks go. You have one going up Avenue B, so people all the way downtown can get to places. You have them crisscrossing, so there's more than the L train and the S train that goes, sideways and stuff. But that the problem is, of course, even if you have zillions of dollars, you can't just close the subways for you. What the hell can you do?
If you close the subways, you'd be closing the city. You'd be sending everyone someplace else. And we can send everyone, all 8 million people, 8.5 million people someplace else. The answer to your question, it's a perfect question. It's incremental. The New York City public transportation system and our roadways were built by increments, section by section by section.
Sure.
So the subways all came online at different times. They began as independent, profit-making businesses, which were later on taken over by the city of New York.
So does IRT mean that it was an independent thing?
IRT was Interborough Rapid Transit.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
BMT was Bronx Manhattan Transit. They all went bankrupt, and they were all purchased by the city of New York and combined into New York City's subway system. The Transit Authority was created to take it over. It was incremental. For us to try and rebuild what it took close to 2 centuries to build would be impossible. We've recently completed the Second Avenue subway, which is a major accomplishment. And slowly but surely, we keep rebuilding and improving the infrastructure. Our problem now, of course, and the last bridge we ever built in New York City was the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge. And we're now rebuilding some of the bridges we have in the city right now because they're falling down. But the issue is, how much more can we do with what we have? We don't know. It has to be incremental. We can't start all over again. We have to make it better and better and better. I'm very concerned about the subways, and I'm very concerned about what will happen after the pandemic, because we need to get people back on the subways again. Without people paying fares to use the subways, there's no money to maintain the subways. And I'm afraid that the subways will fail. I even look at buses as they go up and down Fifth Avenue and Sixth Avenue, and they're half empty.
Well, they should. I'm sorry, they ought to be. They have to be right now. They shouldn't be filling up until maybe August, honestly.
And as soon as the pandemic is over, we need to get people back to using public transportation, because we need to continue the incremental improvements that I'm talking about now that make the transportation system.
But wouldn't this have been the ideal time, since so many fewer people, is that a construction, are using these things, that this is a good, it's like Broadway theaters. This is a really good time to shore them up and gussy them up and make changes, because they ain't being used.
The only problem is there's no money. Right now, we are expecting to see an enormous drop in taxes collected in this current year. Think the theaters are closed, the restaurants are closed, the stores are doing very poor. People are not collecting taxes for rentals. Even Soho, which I mentioned earlier, a lot of those high-end stores are closed for business or gone out of business. The city is not collecting taxes. The city does not have the tax money to make the improvements we're talking about. We need to have a robust economy. Only when we have a robust economy can we continue to improve the city of New York. And I have great faith in the city of New York, and I don't know how much longer I'll be here, but I have great faith in the city of New York and the ability for New York City to come back. We came back from 9/11. We came back from Superstorm Sandy. We will come back from this pandemic, but it will take time, and it will need people to continue to have faith in the city and to continue to spend money in the city. In my building right here in Greenwich Village, which is a 90-unit cooperative building, we have many people who have sold their apartments and gone to other locations outside of the city. We need for people to come back and not give up on New York City.
Well, let me ask you though. I mean, you're saying this even as I think Ray, he wants to go live in the Philippines, and he's kind of like, come on, it's a great place to retire. You don't have the cold, and New York is seems to be going sort of downhill, at least at the moment. So, but you are tenuously grabbing towards remaining in the city, I assume. I mean, this is our
plan, and we were going to implement it before the pandemic happened. We
Right.
would spend the winters in the Philippines and the summers in New York, having the
Perfect. I mean, if you came to that compromise, that always seemed to me like the perfect compromise, because you didn't want to live Philippines full time, and it's not fair to make him be away from his people and his family and his culture for 365 days a year. Halvesies here, halvesies, and you pick the right times of year too. Yes, yes. So as soon as this pandemic, is that what you're gonna implement?
Our plan was we were supposed to have gone for this past Christmas, but we couldn't go. The Philippines is locked down, and frankly, we're not sure if we would sublet or rent our apartment or whatever, or work something out where someone could occupy this apartment while we're not here. But the plans couldn't go through because of the sudden lockdown. It came so quickly that we could not, and Ray was so disappointed
I'm
that
sure.
we could not go home for Christmas. Our goal, one way or another, is to go home for Christmas next year.
Well, or let's call it Hanukkah, because Michael, you're still one of the tribe, kind of. So we'll say Christmas and Hanukkah,
Right.
and Kwanzaa, and at least by Festivus. I hope that you will be where you both want to be at least part of the time. By the way, is Ray there? If you want to get him on camera, you want to say hi?
I hate to say this, but Ray is sleeping. I'd love to have him come and say hello. Ray, let me explain what has happened.
1:30 in the morning, in the afternoon. Yeah.
First of all, this is the middle of the night to Ray. So, like, how could you be doing a program in the middle of the night? Ray was a nurse before his retirement last year, and he was on night shift, which means 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. I have not, which means he goes to sleep at 10 o'clock in the morning, so he can go back to work again at 7 p.m. at night. It has been the most difficult thing in the world for me to have him change his schedule to meet a schedule whereby he's home during the day. So we have our time together in the evening, and then I go to sleep, and he's up half the night. He's on YouTube. He talks to his family in the Philippines, because when it's 2 a.m. here in New York, it's 2 p.m. in Manila. 12-hour difference.
So he's retired from, he's not a nurse anymore. He doesn't even have to do it, but he's still keeping those hours. Wow.
And also it works because he needs to maintain they talk on FaceTime to each other.
Yeah.
And always in communication in the middle of the night, which to them is the middle of the day. So right now we're talking in the morning, but for him, it's like he just went to sleep. He's now getting his night sleep during the day. So I'm sorry I can't call him out to say hello, but I don't really go.
No, absolutely. But do wish him a very happy 2021.
Thank you.
A little late to say Happy New Year, but most happy New Year to you. We've been talking to my cousin, Michael Levine. And before I let you go, I gotta ask one more question. Do you, since this is my show, and since I've got the ego here, do you have any memories of little me?
Of little you?
Me, like when I was 5 or 8 or 12 or 19 or whatever. Do you have any or the first time you saw me as a
No, well, the fondest memory I have is sitting around the Passover Seder table in your dad's and your mom's dining room. We always stuffed as many people as possible at the tables. Do you remember? I don't know how we put 20 to 25 people on that table for our Passover Seders. But I remember you as a little kid who always was joking around, had so much fun at the party. And whenever it would come to reading, because we would go around the room and read different portions of the Haggadah together in English, whenever it would come to you, you would take the portion that you were reading and you would try to dramatize it and turn it into something humorous or something, instead of just being plain language, which we got bored with, to make it dramatic, to make it funny, to do something to uplift our spirits. So he was this little kid sitting at the table, trying to have as much fun as possible with the Haggadah, which is something we've heard every year for the past 2,000 years. You always had so much fun with that as a little kid, and that's something I'll never forget.
That is, talk about a memory that I want to hear, and talk about. Just very happy to hear that, and very happy that that's of all the Seder stories, and then people eating white horseradish instead of red, and this, and no, it's Dave being an idiot that I remember. So.
But Dave, you were always entertaining, and that was the point. It was always wonderful to see you and hear you smiling at the table. You always made it fun.
Well, it was always so great because you had a very different energy at all our family gatherings too, because we're all, you know, as my wife would call us, all old shtetl Jews with our set in our ways, and you know, Brooklyn ghetto and Long Island ghetto, and here's cousin Michael, and he lives in the city, and he's got such a different life, and he works for New York State or New York City, and it was just like, you know, you were just someone part of family, and yet on some level a little outside our family, that made you fascinating in a kind of a great way, and still are. I mean, there's been.
Thank you, Dave. I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that because you're right. I was always lived a little a part of life, a little bit apart from family, but I was always part of family, and that's what you're saying. You remember how important family always was to all of us.
Yeah. Well, I am honored that you are part of our family, Michael Levine. I wish you, first of all, health. I'm glad you and Ray are both, you know, healthy. And I wish that maybe by Christmas, well, Hanukkah, whatever, by Tu B'Shvat, that you and Ray.
Tu B'Shvat's next week.
Oh dear. All right, maybe not Tu B'Shvat. Maybe Passover. Maybe
right.
Passover. You'll be making plans. You'll be calling the airlines to go to the Philippines for a while. You know, in the summer here or whatever, and then be back with us in New York and in our world. Michael Levine, it just remains for me to thank you so much for being with me on my birthday.
And Dave, let me thank you for having me on your program. I've done oral histories quite frequently now, and this one has been a pleasure doing it with a relative. I really love being with you. It has been so much fun. And please send my regards to the whole family, and a great big kiss to your wife. I miss her.
Well, yeah, miss you too. Thank you, Michael. And I want to send out an invite too. If you do feel over the weeks ahead, you want to come and play the game with David and Leslie, let me know.
Great,
that would be great to have you. Okay.
Thank you again.
Happy times to you. Thank you, Michael.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Michael Levine in the neighborhood, my cousin. Boy, oh boy, what an interesting and smart and well-spoken and fascinating and fabulous person. Michael Levine. Very proud that he is my cousin and happy to have him in the neighborhood. Yes, here on this Saturday, January 23rd, 2021, with the 782nd episode of Dave's Gone By.